Thank you, Carl. Yeah, you introduced me. I'm from the Norwegian Tibet Committee. And you have introduced today's program very, very well, Carl. So I will just go on and say that today's first panel discussion will address the alarming situation of human rights and censorship in China. Håkon Gjerløv, senior researcher at PRIO, the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, will lead this discussion. But first, let me introduce one of the panelists, Professor Laura Murphy. She will be today's keynote speaker on Uyghur forced labor in China's renewable industry. Dr. Laura Murphy is a professor of human rights and contemporary slavery at the Helena Kennedy Center for International Justice at Sheffield, Hallam University. That was a long... She is an awarded scholar and has recently worked on several research projects about the Chinese government's intertwined systems of internment and forced labor that has been inflicted on the people of East Turkestan. Please welcome our first keynote speaker, Professor Laura Murphy, on stage. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for having me. I want to thank all the organizers who put this together. I've put events like this together before. It's not a lot of fun. This is the big day. You'll get to rest tomorrow. Thank you also to all of you who came out on Saturday to think about this fairly intense subject. And also thank you, I just want to sort of give a thanks to the Uyghur community for being bold and speaking out against this, whether they do it quietly at home or whether they do it outside in the world. I take a lot of my inspiration from them. I have 20 minutes, and I have a timer, because we've got a lot to do today. And so because I don't have a lot of time, I decided to sort of focus in on 4 very seemingly simple points, but very distinct points that overlapped, distinct and overlapping. Points about China's rapid expansion of its renewable industry manufacturing in the Uyghur region in the last 10 years. I'm going to argue that it is deliberate, that it is oppressive, that it is dangerous, but that it's also, the tide is turning on it. And I think that that's an important point to make. And a point I could have made a couple years ago. So first of all, deliberate. In the last 10 years, the Chinese government, the central PRC government, has put out numerous directives that are extremely explicit about the role the Uyghur region will play in expanding the country's capacity to lead in the renewable industry future, in the renewable future. There are many central government directives, there are regional government directives, there are local government directives that are all about ensuring that the development of polysilicon expands, the development of electric vehicle capacity to manufacture expands, and all of the sort of critical mineral mining and processing that they can do in the Uyghur region is expanding. And a lot of companies are being incentivized to move out to the Uyghur region to do this work. This is partially because this work is extremely dirty, some of it, right? When we think about the manufacturing of alumina into aluminum, they make alumina outside of the Uyghur region, they ship it to the Uyghur region where the dirty part of the work happens. It's also because, again, it's dirty. The production of polysilicon takes a lot of energy. And the Uyghur region has 40% of China's coal reserves. And while the rest of the world, including other parts of China, make their polysilicon out of using hydro energy or other forms of energy, the Xinjiang production is 100% based on coal energy, and it's a highly energy consumptive process. So China has taken advantage of that cheap coal and moving companies out there to do this dirty work. They're also being deliberate about it by giving huge corporate incentives and subsidies to companies that move out to that region. These subsidies include free rent, no tax for 3 years and only 50% tax for the following 2 or 3 years, free land, rental in industrial parks, the building of massive industrial parks, computers, desks, chairs, like down to the very small pieces and parts of running a business. The Chinese government is providing subsidies or free access to these things for companies that move out to the Uyghur region. And they're incentivizing energy prices, right? They're subsidizing energy prices, which makes the low price of coal even lower. And so, again, undercutting the price of the energy, the cost of production in that region. And also, they're doing this by promising incentives for labor transfers. And those labor transfers, some of them are from the mainland of highly technical, highly skilled engineers and other folks to move from Jiangsu, for instance, out to Xinjiang, where a lot of people in the rest of China think of quite poorly and don't want to move out to. And also they're being moved to the middle of a desert, the middle of a coal field. So practically no one wants to go live in the middle of a coal field. And so they have to incentivize that. So companies are getting incentives to move engineers out to the Uyghur region and to move Uyghur people and other minoritized citizens into work. So those labor incentives are also a part of that package. So this is a deliberate program to move people out, but it is also oppressive by design. Part of this is about understanding that Uyghur people and the land they live on is treated as disposable in China. People are understood to be, there's just a sort of rampant racism across much of China that diminishes actually the closer you get to Xinjiang, and I've experienced this firsthand, but there's a rampant racism that understands Uyghur people as backwards, as uneducatable, as low-skilled, as slow, as unproductive. And so companies have not wanted to move out to that region to work because they believe that Han people will work faster and harder. But, again, about this deliberateness, people in the rest of China are demanding higher wages every day. And they're undercutting those wages and those workers by using Uyghur laborers. And not just by using Uyghur laborers and underpaying them, which they're doing also, but by using the system of mass internment as a coercive element that makes it so that Uyghur people move into factory work. That project is not meant just to provide jobs, as the Chinese government says, but it's meant to make people docile. It's meant to make them too busy to dissent. It's about securing, and this is about the deliberateness again too, securing the Chinese Communist Party's power and its ability to maintain power in the face of what is justifiable dissent on the part of Uyghur people and other minoritized people across China. And so in order to maintain that control, they've created a massive system of forced labor that is state-sponsored, it is ubiquitous, and it is unlike anything else we've ever seen. The basic idea is that within the Uyghur region, people who are deemed to be minorities, they are not in fact the minority in that region, and so it's important to state that, but people of Uyghur and Kazakh descent have been deemed to be in need of employment. Now, many of these people, employment employment because they have been infected with the virus of terrorism. And this, when I say these phrases, they're in deep scare quotes, of course, and they come directly from government directives that I read every day. That Uyghur and other minoritized people in that region have been infected by terrorism, and that has, the justification goes, that has created a situation where they don't want to work, where women want to stay home and raise their children, where people do not necessarily, they feel attached to the land and want to be farmers. And the Chinese government has deemed this backwards and has deemed it tantamount to terrorist thinking. Terrorist thinking, even just the thought, even just the perception of a terrorist thought, is punishable by internment and imprisonment in China, in the Uyghur region. And in the Uyghur region alone. And that's why this is quite different from other coercive and oppressive systems of labor in the rest of China, which do exist, and which we shouldn't diminish. But this is different because when a Uyghur person refuses a government program, they are deemed to be infected by terrorism and are eligible to be sent to a labor camp or to a an internment camp or to a, check my time, or to a prison. And so while people across all of human history, across all of the world, many people move from farms to factories as a form of social mobility. Across China, people are engaged in these labor transfer programs. In the Uyghur region alone, people simply cannot say no. Many people might want to join a labor program, right? But in the Uyghur region, you cannot say no, because to say no is to risk going to camps. And every single person knows someone who's in the camps. Many people, 1 million or more people have been to the camps. They know what happens in those camps. You know what happens in those camps. Nobody wants to risk that. And so these labor programs go hand in hand with manufacturing expansion in the region, because this provides the jobs that they can move people into to get them separated from their families, separated from their culture and community, separated from any opportunity for dissent, too busy to dissent, and also monitored and surveilled at all times, forced to speak another language or not speak at all, which is part of the process, is silencing Uyghur people in general, not just their dissent, but entirely, including their transmission of their culture. And we have seen ample evidence that this is happening not only in low-skilled work, but in companies that do primarily high-skilled work, like the production of polysilicon. People aren't manning the computers. They're not engineers. In fact, the job ads explicitly forbid Uyghur people from working in those jobs often. Uyghur people are employed doing menial labor, putting coal into furnaces, cleaning up coal dust, cracking manually rocks that in other parts of the world and other parts of China are cracked with machines. So we're seeing Uyghur people being moved into these jobs, even Uyghur people who were professionals. This is not a poverty alleviation program, as the Chinese government says. It is a systematic program of oppression and coercion that is state-sponsored and is applied to every person in the Uyghur region of Uyghur descent. And this is explicit by government directive. So it's deliberate, it's oppressive by design, and it's dangerous. Obviously, it's dangerous for Uyghur people, but I want to argue that it's also dangerous for all of us globally. First of all, it's dangerous in terms of rights. China is doing this largely with impunity. They are able to do this and not be held to any of the international standards that we all hold dear. They're able to claim that this is a culturally and politically important process that they're doing. They're able to claim that this is, in fact, in the name of human rights. And while many of us are outraged, they're able to hold international bodies hostage, essentially, in doing anything to punish them for this or to stop it. And they are exporting these oppressive systems. They're exporting the surveillance systems that maintain power and maintain control over Uyghur lives and Uyghur work. They're sending this to other countries that are authoritarian or have authoritarian aspirations, are able to purchase these packages and spread this form of oppression to their own minoritized people. So that, for one, is of concern globally. Second, economically, global economics, it's dangerous. It is dangerous for us in terms of global economics. When we use forced labor, that on its own undercuts the value of labor globally. It has made it so that companies cannot produce the same products around the world because they can't pay such low prices for labor. But it's not just labor. Labor is a very small part, in fact, of the cost of producing polysilicon, for instance, or the cost of producing an electric vehicle. What's happening in this expansion of the renewable energy sector in the Uyghur region is that this is all being done on the at the low cost of coal energy, which constitutes, I think I read this, I was reading it this morning and then I got distracted. It's something like 40% of the cost of polysilicon is in the energy, right? And so if they can undercut the price of that by using coal, which no one else would do to make renewable energy, no one else does, they're able to undercut the price to the extent that no one can compete. And we've seen companies in Korea, we've seen companies in the United States, in Europe shut their doors because they cannot compete with the low price of polysilicon being made in the Uyghur region. And so what we have then is a global economy that cannot compete for renewables, and one country that's able to have all of the market. Xinjiang alone produces 45% of the world's solar-grade polysilicon. 45% in this region that no one had heard of 10 years ago. Many people had heard of, some of us had heard of, but many people were not talking about 10 years ago. And the solar energy industry was not talking about 10 years ago. But within 10 years, they have become the world's leading producer of solar-grade polysilicon because of how cheaply they can make it, because of how dirtily they are making it. Is dirtily a word? I don't know. So, so because of that, there's no market that is able to compete. Companies are shutting down. Innovation had slowed in that arena because the price of polysilicon was so cheap that there was no use innovating other forms, expensive innovation. It's high cost to innovate. So innovation had slowed. This was a problem. It is also a problem for us in terms of what I thought. In terms of the environment. And this is where I think a lot of people miss the point. There are many people who come to me and say, Laura, you have to stop talking about this human rights issue because you're pitting human rights against the future of the planet. Thank you. Throw things. I really think we need not only to be angry about this false tension that people are posing, we should be very worried about it because it's a very political move to sideline concerns about human rights with the logic of urgency. And I read a thing once about white supremacy, and one of the logics of white supremacy is urgency, and this is one of those places where I really see it, where the concerns of people who live very, very far away and their lives and their livelihoods is absolutely taking a backseat to what we think is urgent. And we use this discourse of urgency to ensure that people say, oh, well, we really have to set that aside because obviously the planet will burn if we don't act on this urgently. Both the human rights crisis and the planet are in an urgent situation. And we need to address both simultaneously. We cannot sacrifice one for the urgency of the other. And I'm going to argue in a second, and I only have a few more, that these things actually go hand in hand. And so I want to turn to why I think the tide is turning and why we should not think that addressing the human rights crisis in the Uyghur region is in tension with addressing the climate crisis. And that is because what we have seen in the last 2 years, I would not be able to say what I'm saying now 2 years ago, but what we have seen in the last 2 years, because of international awareness and pressure on this issue, is not a China that is changing necessarily, right? We're not seeing the PRC government saying, well, okay, well, you're right. That's really terrible. We shouldn't do that. We are a bunch of racists. No, we're not seeing that. What we are seeing, however, is a massive shift in supply chains that would not have happened so rapidly, might not have happened at all, had we not put pressure, had we not said, this is a human rights crisis. It was already a global economic crisis that China is moving all manufacturing there and undercutting the prices of all other possibilities, all other competition. But the human rights crisis seems to have brought enough people's attention to realize that this is a significant issue that we must address, and we must shift supply chains because the human rights claims are not going to work. We must wage an economic cost if we expect anything to change, right? And so that shift in supply chains has meant that we are seeing a rapid expansion of the development of the solar energy industry across the world, more rapid than we would have seen if we had not paid attention to this issue. And so people will say, oh, this is going to slow down. I will admit, it has slowed down the expansion of our solar capacity around the world for a minute. for a minute. But this is where we have to understand that urgency doesn't mean today necessarily, although I will say that we need to address the Uyghur crisis today. But it means having a just transition that really understands what it takes to do this correctly this time, right? To address Uyghur rights, in the process of addressing Uyghur rights, we have seen companies, city procurement, not just municipal, but also full national procurement change their suppliers for solar panels. We have seen massive companies decide we're not going to buy Xinjiang-affected solar panels. I've talked to developers who do installations for the World Bank who have shifted their suppliers. Companies are changing. We're seeing this happening. Governments are changing. Individuals are changing, are demanding that they have Xinjiang-free polysilicon. This is important because it changes it creates a market for polysilicon and solar products being made outside of the Uyghur region. We're seeing expansion in India. We're seeing companies that had closed reopening. We're seeing expansion from rocks all the way to the panels, the entire supply chain. We're seeing investments in solar energy and other renewables from governments and from like development finance, money that was going to the Uyghur region, now going elsewhere to expand capacity, to diversify the supply chain. That needed to happen. That diversification might not have happened, and that expanded capacity is happening more rapidly than we knew. We're going to have to wait a year and a half for all of it to come online. But the bonus is that it addresses the Uyghur crisis and that it addresses the climate crisis. It expands our capacity to address the climate crisis more rapidly than it would have otherwise. And we're also seeing governments look at import bans. The US has the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. It's increasing the rapidity with which we're going to address forced labor globally as well. And this is enormous. People who've worked in my field for decades have never seen change this quick. So in response to what is probably the worst human rights crisis I hope we'll ever see, we are responding. Things are changing, and things are changing at the climate level, at the rights level, in ways that they might not have otherwise. And so I think that what we're seeing now is a change that brings these issues together, that really addresses these simultaneous and intertwined crises in a way that is very positive. And so I'm turning, where I used to be very depressed all the time, I'm turning to think that there is some hope. And at the very least, these changes are making it so that we're not consuming the oppression of Uyghur people. And at the very least, that's good enough for me. So thank you.